A stretch of desert road along Saudi Arabia's southern border with Yemen, sometime in the mid-2010s, the exact date impossible to pin down because dozens of nearly identical incidents were filmed and uploaded over the following years. The Saudi Arabian M1A2 Abrams, a tank widely regarded on paper as one of the most survivable armored vehicles ever built, sits stationary near a border outpost. A thin wire trails across the sand toward a Houthi fighter crouched several kilometers away, guiding a Soviet-designed anti-tank missile whose basic technology dates back to the 1970s, the missile strikes. The tank does not explode in the dramatic, instantaneous fireball popular culture has taught audiences to expect from a modern main battle tank. It simply stops, smoke curling from the turret, the crew scrambling out under fire, and within minutes the video is uploaded and circulating across military forums and news outlets worldwide, each new upload chipping away at the reputation of what the tank's own manufacturer and the United States Army itself have spent 4 decades describing as functionally unbeatable in a direct engagement. Over the following years, estimates of Saudi Arabia's Abrams losses in Yemen would range from a documented handful into the dozens, sourced from leaked defense procurement records describing new tank orders as quiet battle damage replacements rather than fleet expansion. The tank being destroyed in these videos and the tank operated by the United States Army share the same name, the same basic silhouette, and the same reputation. They do not share the same armor, and that single distinction turns out to explain almost everything about why this story unfolds the way it does. Its name is the M1A2 Abrams, and its history is really the history of 2 different tanks wearing one name, one of which has never been confirmed destroyed by enemy fire in nearly 3.5 decades of active American service, and one of which has been picked apart on camera by fighters using missiles older than most of the crews operating against them. To understand why the M1A2 exists and why its story bends so sharply depending on whose flag is painted on the turret, you need to trace the Abrams family back to its origins in the early 1970s, when the United States Army, watching Israeli tank losses mount against Soviet-supplied anti-tank missiles during the Yom Kippur War, concluded that its existing tank fleet needed an entirely new design built around composite armor, better crew survivability, and a fundamentally different approach to protection than anything America had fielded before. The original M1 entered service in 1980 armed with a 105mm gun, followed in 1985 by the M1A1, which introduced the license-built 120mm M256 smoothbore cannon derived from a German Rheinmetall design and, in later production blocks, layers of depleted uranium armor woven into the composite plating for a dramatic increase in protection against both kinetic penetrators and shaped charge warheads. The M1A1 became the tank that carried American armored forces through the Gulf War in 1991, a conflict that, while fought primarily by M1A1S rather than the M1A2 this video focuses on, cemented the Abrams family's reputation as a platform capable of destroying Soviet-built Iraqi armor at ranges and in conditions, including night combat and dust storms, that Iraqi crews simply could not match. The M1A2 itself entered service in 1992, built around a philosophy that shifted the tank's core advantage away from armor and firepower alone and toward information. Its defining feature was the inter-vehicle information system, allowing tanks within a formation to share targeting data, friendly and enemy positions, and battlefield awareness digitally rather than relying purely on radio voice communication, alongside a commander's independent thermal viewer that let the tank commander scan for targets independently of wherever the gunner happened to be looking, dramatically improving the crew's collective situational awareness. Successive system enhancement package upgrades through the 1990s and 2000s layered on improved displays, better thermal imaging, and refined fire control software, culminating in the SCP-B3 configuration, redesignated M1A2C in 2018, which entered production in 2017 and began reaching frontline units in 2020, adding the ammunition data link system for programmable ammunition, an improved forward-looking infrared sight, and, for the first time, integration plans for the Israeli-developed Trophy Active Protection System, the same hard-kill defense against guided missiles this channel has already covered in detail on the German Leopard 2A8. In its full American configuration, The M1A2 weighs approximately 68 to 70 tonnes depending on the specific armor package installed, powered by the distinctive AGT1500 gas turbine engine, a design choice unusual among modern tanks that trades poor fuel economy for exceptional acceleration and quiet operation compared to the diesel engines nearly every rival army uses. Top speed reaches around 67 kilometers per hour on level ground, with the tank's 120mm main gun capable of firing the M829 series of depleted uranium kinetic penetrator rounds, ammunition specifically designed to defeat the composite and reactive armor of the most heavily protected Soviet and Russian tanks in existence. Crew remains at 4: commander, gunner, loader, and driver, and the vehicle's frontal armor array, built around layers of depleted uranium mesh sandwiched within composite ceramic and steel, represents one of the most heavily protected tank designs ever fielded by any nation. Protection that the United States Army has, as a matter of firm policy, refused to export in its full domestic configuration to any foreign customer, Saudi Arabia included. If you are finding this deep dive into the engineering and combat history of one of the most recognizable tanks in the world useful, hit subscribe. It takes a second, costs nothing, and it helps the channel keep making this kind of content. That export restriction is the single most important fact required to understand why the M1A2's combat record looks so wildly different depending on which flag flies over the vehicle in question. When American forces spearheaded the invasion of Iraq in 2003, armored columns built substantially around the Abrams family conducted the famous armored thrusts into Baghdad that came to be known as the Thunder Runs, driving directly through the heart of a defended capital city with a speed and survivability that stunned observers on both sides, absorbing rocket-propelled grenade hits, small arms fire, and improvised ambushes while continuing to advance, losses across the entire Abrams fleet in that campaign remaining remarkably low relative to the scale and intensity of urban combat involved. American Abrams crews operating the tank in its full domestic configuration, with complete depleted uranium armor arrays and, in later years, additional urban survivability upgrade kits fitted specifically for close-quarters combat, built a service record over more than 3 decades in which no United States Army M1 series tank has ever been publicly confirmed destroyed by direct enemy fire, though vehicles have certainly been damaged, disabled, or lost to mines, improvised explosive devices, and on tragic occasions to friendly fire. Export customers received a categorically different vehicle. The M1A2S, sold to Saudi Arabia, along with export configurations sold to other allied nations, omits the classified depleted uranium armor package entirely, substituting a less capable composite arrangement that United States export control policy has never permitted foreign militaries, even close treaty allies, to receive in the full domestic specification. When Saudi Arabia committed its Abrams fleet to the intervention in Yemen beginning in 2015, those tanks, deployed in static border positions, and slow-moving columns against Houthi fighters equipped with decades-old but still lethal wire-guided anti-tank missiles, proved considerably more vulnerable than their American counterparts, a vulnerability compounded by tactical decisions, including static positioning without adequate infantry screening and limited use of available countermeasures, that defense analysts have repeatedly identified as at least as significant a factor as the armor gap itself. Estimates of Saudi Abrams losses in that conflict remain difficult to verify precisely given the kingdom's limited public disclosure, but leaked American arms sale documentation describing new tank deliveries as battle damage replacements, combined with the volume of destruction footage the Houthi movement itself has published, leaves little doubt that the export configuration absorbed real and repeated losses against an adversary equipped with weapons that predate the tank itself by decades. The M1A2 story took a further international turn through the 2020s, as the SEPV3 or M1A2C variant became a significant export product in its own right, with Poland ordering 250 examples and Australia committing to 75, as both nations moved to modernize their armored forces amid growing concern over Russian military posture in Europe and the broader Indo-Pacific. Orders that, unlike the earlier Saudi purchases, have generally included more modern armor packages closer to, though still not identical to, the full American domestic standard. The tank's most direct recent combat exposure came not through the M1A2 specifically, but through a related variant, the M1A1SA, when the United States committed a battalion's worth of tanks to Ukraine in 2023. deployments that generated intense public debate after several were lost to drone strikes and guided anti-tank missiles in the heavily contested terrain around Avdiivka in 2024, prompting reports that American advisors recommended temporarily withdrawing the tanks from frontline positions to reassess employment tactics against a drone-saturated battlefield that, as this channel's coverage of the Leopard 2A8 and the 2S-38 Derivatsiya PVO has already explored in detail, has forced every modern military to reconsider assumptions about tank survivability built up over the preceding several decades. The depleted uranium armor at the center of this entire story carries its own complicated history worth understanding in more detail. Depleted uranium, a byproduct of the uranium enrichment process with roughly 40% of the radioactivity of naturally occurring uranium, was selected for the Abrams armor package specifically for its exceptional density, nearly twice that of steel, allowing engineers to pack considerably more effective protection into the same physical thickness than conventional steel or ceramic composite armor alone could achieve. The exact composition and layering of the M1A2's depleted uranium armor array remains one of the most closely guarded classified specifications in the entire United States defense establishment, a secrecy that explains why export configurations, even for close allies who receive advanced American fighter aircraft and other sensitive technology, have never been permitted to include the full domestic armor package. This same material, used in certain armor-piercing ammunition rather than armor itself, became the subject of considerable public health controversy following the Gulf War and subsequent conflicts, with veterans groups and some researchers raising concerns about depleted uranium exposure among both military personnel and civilian populations in areas where such munitions were used extensively, concerns that United States and NATO health assessments have generally concluded do not point to significant elevated health risk from the armor itself, though the debate around depleted uranium ammunition specifically has remained a persistent point of controversy across multiple conflicts. The Trophy Active Protection System now being integrated into the M1A2C configuration deserves particular attention given how directly it connects the Abrams program to broader trends this channel has already documented on other modern platforms. Unlike the passive protection depleted uranium armor provides, absorbing and deflecting an incoming round through sheer material density and geometry, Trophy actively detects incoming guided missiles and rocket-propelled grenades using turret-mounted radar, then fires an interceptor countermeasure to destroy the threat meters before impact, precisely the same system already discussed in this channel's coverage of the German Leopard 2A8. The decision to integrate an Israeli-developed system into America's own frontline tank, rather than developing a comparable domestic alternative, reflects the same calculation German planners made, prioritizing a system with an extensive, genuinely proven combat record over the slower and riskier path of building something equivalent from scratch, and it directly addresses precisely the kind of guided, anti-tank missile threat that has proven so costly to export configuration Abrams tanks lacking equivalent countermeasures in Yemen. Whether Trophy integration would have changed the outcome of any specific engagement in Yemen remains impossible to say with certainty, since Saudi Arabia's M1A2S fleet was never fitted with the system during the period documented in the most widely circulated combat footage, but the logic behind adding it to the American fleet's own future configuration is, in essence, a direct acknowledgement that armor thickness alone, however formidable, is no longer considered sufficient defense against the guided munitions that have increasingly defined tank losses across every major conflict of the past 2 decades. Return to that stretch of desert road along the Saudi-Yemeni border. A tank descended directly from the same production lines, sharing the same silhouette, the same gun, and the same name as one of the most heavily protected armored vehicles ever built, sits disabled by a missile technology old enough that the officers who designed the M1A2's armor in the first place would have recognized it instantly from Cold War intelligence briefings decades earlier. Every criticism leveled at the Abrams family in Yemen is accurate and well documented. Export versions genuinely lack the classified armor package that has kept American crews alive through 3 decades of continuous combat deployment. Static employment without adequate infantry and reconnaissance support genuinely left Saudi tanks exposed to exactly the kind of patient, well-prepared ambush that any armored vehicle, regardless of its protection level, remains vulnerable to when employed carelessly. And yet in American hands, operating with the full domestic armor specification, integrated digital battlefield awareness, and doctrine built specifically around combined arms support rather than isolated static positions. The same basic tank family has compiled a service record across the Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq, and more than 2 decades of subsequent deployments in which no confirmed loss to direct enemy fire has ever been officially acknowledged. The M1A2 was never one single tank with one single combat record. It was always 2 tanks wearing the same name, one built to a standard its own government has never been willing to sell to anyone, and one built to whatever standard that same government judged acceptable for an ally to receive instead, and the gap between those 2 standards, more than any single engineering decision, is the real story of how this tank has actually performed everywhere it has ever been sent to fight.